Welcome to Raw Tales Africa. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications because it will mean the whole world to me. Today's story will shake you to your core and remind you why we should never judge people by their appearance. Brace yourself for a tale of greed, betrayal, and divine justice that will leave you speechless. The entire congregation sat in stunned silence as Pastor Chidi held up the bank statement, his hands trembling with rage and disbelief. 15 million naira, he whispered into the microphone, his voice cracking. 15 million naira, meant for our new orphanage, for feeding the hungry, for helping the poor. Gone. His wife, Blessing, stood frozen at the altar, her designer handbag clutched to her chest, expensive jewelry glittering under the church lights. The same woman who had preached about humility and service just as before now stood exposed as a thief. And you, Pastor Chidi pointed to the corner where a blind man sat quietly. You tried to warn us. You tried to tell us the truth, but we were too proud to listen to a beggar. The blind man, Chukwuma, simply nodded, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The truth always finds a way to shine, Pastor. Always. But this story started 3 months earlier when pride met poverty and greed met grace. Let me take you back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, the sun had barely risen over the dusty streets of Enugu when Chukwuma felt his way along the familiar path to St. Matthew's Anglican Church. His walking stick tapped rhythmically against the concrete, a sound that had become as natural to him as breathing. Though he couldn't see the world around him, he knew every crack in the pavement, every pothole, every gentle slope that led to the church gate. Chukwuma had been blind since birth, but his other senses are sharpened like finely tuned instruments. He could smell rain coming from miles away, hear the difference between genuine laughter and fake politeness, and most importantly, he could sense the character of a person from their voice, their footsteps, their presence. At 62 years old, he had spent the last 15 years sitting at the same spot outside St. Matthew's Church, not really begging, but accepting whatever kindness people offered. He wasn't there for the money, though he needed it to survive. He was there because he had found something precious in that place. Genuine faith, real love, and the kind of community that looked after its own. Good morning, Papa Chukwuma, called out Mrs. Adaize, one of the church's oldest members, as she hurried past him with her grandchildren. How did you sleep? Like a baby, he replied with a gentle smile, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had learned to find joy in small things. And you? How is your arthritis? Better, thank you for asking. Here, she pressed a small bag into his hands. Yesterday's bread, still soft. This was his world. Small acts of kindness from people who had little but shared anyway. The church members knew him, respected him, and some even sought his counsel. Despite his blindness and poverty, Chukwuma had something many sighted people lacked: wisdom born from listening, really listening to the world around him. Inside the church, the atmosphere was different. Pastor Chidi Okafor was a man of God in the truest sense, humble, hardworking, and completely devoted to his congregation. At 45, he had spent 20 years building St. Matthew's from a small chapel to a thriving community of over 500 members. His sermons were powerful not because he shouted or performed, but because he lived what he preached. The kingdom of heaven, he would say, is not about what we have, but what we give. Not about what we accumulate, but what we share. His wife, Blessing, sat in the front row during these sermons, nodding and smiling, a Bible marked with colorful highlights and careful notes. To the congregation, she was the perfect pastor's wife, supportive, active in church programs, always ready to help with women's meetings and children's ministry. But appearances, as Chukwuma often reminded people, could be deceiving. Blessing Okafor was a woman of 38 who had married Pastor Chidi when his church was small and his salary even smaller. She had been patient then, working as a primary school teacher to support their family while her husband built his ministry. But as the church grew and the offerings increased, something changed in Blessing's heart. She began to notice what other pastors' wives wore, the cars they drove, the houses they lived in. She started comparing their simple 2-bedroom apartments to the sprawling compounds of prosperity preachers she saw on television. Slowly, quietly, bitterness took root in her heart. "We deserve better," she would whisper to Chidi late at night. "You work so hard, and for what? To live like paupers while the church bank account grows?" But Chidi would remind her of their purpose. "The money is not ours, my love. It belongs to God's work. Every naira is meant for the poor, for the missions, for building God's kingdom." That's when Blessing learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of spiritual submission. She became an expert at looking humble while plotting to get what she felt she deserved. The church's financial structure was simple and transparent. Pastor Chidi handled the spiritual leadership, while Blessing, as the church-appointed treasurer, managed the finances. The bank accounts required 2 signatures for any withdrawal, hers and her husband's. It was a system built on trust, one that had worked perfectly for years, until greed found a way in. The first crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. Chukwuma was sitting in his usual spot, listening to the sounds of the morning, children walking to school, traders setting up their stalls, the distant hum of traffic. He heard the familiar click of high heels on concrete, a sound that had become more frequent in recent months. "Good morning, Mommy Pastor," he called out respectfully as Blessing approached the church gate. Blessing paused, her designer handbag shifting on her shoulder. The bag alone cost more than most church members earned in 6 months. But she told herself it was a gift from a grateful relative. The truth was more complicated. "Morning," she replied curtly, not slowing down. "Mommy Pastor," Chukwuma continued gently, "I wanted to thank you for the new benches in the church. The elders were talking about how comfortable they are. God bless you and Pastor for thinking of the congregation's comfort." Blessing steps faltered. New benches? They hadn't bought any new benches. The church still used the same old wooden pews they had had for years. She forced a smile, forgetting that Chukwuma couldn't see it. "Oh yes, the benches. You are welcome. And the new sound system too," Chukwuma added innocently. Brother Ikena was saying how clear the pastor's voice sounds now during service. These improvements must have cost a lot. Blessing's blood ran cold. There was no new sound system either. The church still used the same crackling microphone and old speakers that cut out during every service. Her mind raced. Why was the blind man talking about purchases that didn't exist? "I have to go," she stammered, hurrying into the church. But Chukwuma's words followed her. He had heard the conversations, the whispered complaints from church members about the constant fundraising, despite the growing account balance. He had listened to the treasurer's reports that mentioned equipment purchases and facility improvements that never seemed to materialize. Most importantly, he had heard the guilty tremor in Blessing's voice when she was caught off guard. Inside the church office, Blessing's hands shook as she logged into the bank account on her laptop. The balance showed 15.7 million naira, money raised for the new orphanage projects, plus regular tithes and offerings. But another account, one that only she knew about, showed a balance of 3.2 million naira. For months, she had been creating false invoices, fake receipts, imaginary purchases, a sound system that was never bought, church benches that were never delivered, renovation work that was never done. Each fictional expense was carefully documented, signed off by her husband who trusted her completely, and the money was quietly transferred to her personal account. The scheme was sophisticated and seemingly foolproof. She had studied the church's giving pattern, learned when large donations come in, and timed her transfers to avoid suspicion. The missing money was spread across dozens of small transactions, each one looking legitimate on paper. But she had made one critical error. She had gotten careless around the blind man who saw more than anyone realized. That evening, as Pastor Chidi led the weekly prayer meeting, Blessing sat in her usual front row seat, her mind racing. She looked out at the congregation, poor people mostly, farmers, traders, teachers, laborers. They gave sacrificially, sometimes bringing bags of rice instead of cash, sometimes pooling their resources to make a significant donation. Mrs. Adaize, the woman who shared her breath with Chukwuma, had recently donated her late husband's watch, the only valuable thing she owned. Young couples saved for months to give their first fruit offering. Children broke their piggy banks to contribute to the orphanage fund. For a moment, Blessing felt the weight of what she had done. These people trusted her. They believed their money was going to help orphans, to spread the gospel, to build God's kingdom. Instead, it was financing her wardrobe, her jewelry, her secret bank account. But then, she looked at her chipped nail polish, her faded dress, her worn-out shoes. She thought about the prosperity preachers on TV, the pastors' wives who drove luxury cars and lived in mansions. She pushed down the guilt and held on to her anger. I deserve better, she whispered to herself, the same words she had been repeating for months. I've sacrificed enough. Outside, Chukwuma sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the prayer meeting. He could hear Pastor Chidi's passionate prayers for wisdom, for provision, for the strength to serve God's people well. He could hear the congregation's heartfelt responses, their genuine faith, their trust in their leaders. But he could also hear something else. The sound of footsteps pacing back and forth, the rustling of someone checking their phone repeatedly, the whispered conversations that stopped when others approached. Something was wrong in the house of God, and even though he couldn't see it, he could sense it. That night, Chukwuma knelt beside his small bed in the tiny room he rented behind the mechanic's shop. The room was barely large enough for a mattress and a wooden box that held his few possessions, but it was home. Father, he prayed quietly, if there is trouble coming to your house, give me wisdom to know what to do. If there is darkness hiding in the light, help me to be a candle. And if there is a stealing among your people, help the truth to shine. He didn't know it yet, but his prayer was about to be answered in ways he could never have imagined. Over the following weeks, Chukwuma began to notice patterns that others missed. His blindness had taught him to rely on his other senses, and those senses were telling him a story of deception and greed. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he heard Blessing's high heels clicking past him into the church office. These weren't regular church days, no services, No meetings, just the treasurer conducting business. But he also heard the sound of her car engine, much smoother and quieter than the old Toyota she used to drive. Mommy Pastor, he called out one Thursday morning, your car sounds different. Did you buy a new one? Blessing's steps altered. She had indeed bought a new car, a sleek Honda Accord that cost more than her husband's annual salary. The story she told Chidi was that her sister in Lagos had given it to her as a gift, but the truth was more expensive. My sister gave it to me, she replied, her voice tight. Ah, your sister is very generous, Chukwuma said thoughtfully. First, the car. Now I am hearing you are building a new house too. God has really blessed your family. Blessing felt her heart stop. She was indeed building a house, a 4-bedroom duplex in the upscale New Haven area of Enugu. The construction was being funded by her stolen money, but officially, she was claiming it was a gift from her late mother's estate. The problem was, she had never mentioned any inheritance to anyone. And now, the blind man was connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. How did you, she started, then caught herself. Yes, my mother left us some things. May her soul rest in peace, Chukwuma said solemnly. But I thought you told Sister Adaize last year that your mother died without leaving anything. That's why you couldn't help with her medical bills when she was sick. The words hit Blessing like a physical blow. She had forgotten that conversation, forgotten that Chukwuma had been sitting nearby when she explained to Mrs. Adaize why she couldn't contribute to another member's medical expenses. The lies were catching up with her, and the blind man seemed to remember everything. I have to go, she said quickly, practically running into the church. But Chukwuma wasn't finished. His suspicions had been growing, and now he was certain something was wrong. That afternoon, he made his way to the church office, tapping his walking stick along the familiar path. Brother Chukwuma, Pastor Chidi's voice was warm and welcoming. Come in, come in. What brings you here today? Pastor, I wanted to ask about the orphanage project. When will construction begin? Pastor Chidi's face fell slightly. We are still raising funds, brother. The estimate is 15 million naira and we are close, but not quite there yet. But the treasurer's report last week said we had enough money, Chukwuma said carefully. 15.7 million in the account. Yes, but that includes money for other projects too. Building maintenance, equipment replacement, pastoral care fund. Pastor Chidi's voice trailed off as he realized he was essentially admitting that specific funds were being used for general purposes. Chukwuma nodded thoughtfully. Ah, I see. Like the new benches and sound system. New benches? What new benches? Pastor Chidi looked confused. The ones your wife mentioned, and the sound system upgrade. She seemed very proud of this improvement. Pastor Chidi looked around his office at the same old furniture, the same crackling sound system, the same worn-out carpets. Nothing had been upgraded or replaced in years. Brother Chukwuma, I think there might be some confusion. We haven't bought new benches or sound equipment. The room fell silent. Both men sat with the weight of realization settling between them. Chukwuma could hear Pastor Chidi's breathing change, could sense the moments when suspicion took root in a trusting heart. Pastor, Chukwuma said gently, would you like me to leave while you make some phone calls? Pastor Chidi nodded slowly, forgetting that his visitor couldn't see him. Yes, I think that would be best. As Chukwuma made his way out of the office, He heard Pastor Chidi's voice behind him, shaky and uncertain. God, what is happening in my house? That evening, Pastor Chidi in his study at home, surrounded by financial records, bank statements, and receipts. Blessing was at a women's meeting at another church, giving him time to investigate without raising suspicion. What he found made his blood run cold. The receipts in their files showed purchases that seemed legitimate at first glance. A sound system from Godwin Electronics, 800,000 naira. Church benches from Mercy Furniture, 1.2 million naira. Building maintenance from Faithful Contractors, 600,000 naira. The documentation looked professional, complete with letterheads, stamps, and detailed invoices. But when Pastor Chidi called the phone numbers on the receipts, he found disconnected lines. When he searched for the companies online, he found no websites, no addresses, no evidence they existed at all. His hands trembling, he opened his laptop and logged into the church's bank account. The statements showed regular transfers to these phantom companies, all authorized with both his signature and blessings. But he had never signed any of these documents. Someone had forged his signature with remarkable skill. Sweet Jesus, he whispered, the magnitude of the betrayal hitting him like a tsunami. She's been stealing from God's house. Meanwhile, across town, Blessing sat in the women's meeting, smiling and nodding as Sister Gladys led a discussion about faithfulness in marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her, but she pushed down the guilt and focused on maintaining her image. Marriage is about trust, Sister Gladys was saying. When that trust is broken, the whole foundation crumbles. The other women nodded and murmured agreement. Blessing found herself studying their faces. Simple women with simple lives, most of them struggling to make ends meet. Yet, here they were, talking about trust and faithfulness while she was systematically robbing their church. Sister Blessing, one of the women said, you and Pastor Chidi are such an inspiration to us. 20 years of marriage and still so united in ministry. What is your secret? All eyes turned to Blessing. She felt the weight of their admiration, their respect, their trust. These women looked up to her, sought her advice, considered her a spiritual mother. How could she explain that she was living a lie? Prayer, she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Constant prayer and communication. The women smiled and nodded, scribbling notes as if she had revealed some great wisdom. But Blessing knew the truth. She hadn't prayed, really prayed in months. How could she face God when she was stealing from his house? After the meeting, as she drove home in a new Honda Accord, Blessing's phone rang. It was her contractor, calling about the house construction. Madam, we need another payment to continue work on the second floor. 2 million naira by Friday or we'll have to stop. Blessing's heart raised. She had already taken more than 3 million naira from the church account. But the house was proving more expensive than anticipated. The car payment, the jewelry, the clothes, it all added up. She needed more money, but taking larger amounts would be harder to hide. I will have it by Friday, she said, already planning her next theft. When she arrived home, she found Chidi still in his study, papers scattered everywhere. Her stomach dropped when she saw the bank statements in his hands. Working late tonight, she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Chidi looked up at her and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Suspicion. Just reviewing her finances, he said slowly, making sure everything is in order for the orphanage project. Blessing's heart pounded, but she maintained her composure. Good. The people are counting on us to be good stewards of their offerings. Yes, Chidi said, his voice flat. Good stewards. That night, they lay in bed like strangers, each lost in their own thoughts. Chidi stared at the ceiling, wrestling with the possibility that his wife, his partner in ministry, had betrayed everything they stood for. Blessing stared into the darkness, planning her next move and wondering how long she could maintain the charade. Neither of them slept well. The next morning brought crisis in the form of Mr. Godwin Okoro, a successful businessman and one of the church's largest donors. He arrived at Pastor Chidi's office with his checkbook and a heart full of generosity. "Pastor, I've been praying about the orphanage project," he said, settling into the chair across from Chidi's desk. "God has blessed my business tremendously this year, and I want to give back. I am prepared to donate 5 million naira to complete the project." Pastor Chidi's heart sank. 5 million naira on top of the 15 million they supposedly already had would be more than enough to build the orphanage. But he couldn't accept the money, not when he suspected their existing funds had been stolen. "Brother Godwin, I am deeply touched by your generosity," he said carefully, "but perhaps we should wait until we are ready to break ground. The planning phase is taking longer than expected." Mr. Okoro looked surprised, "But Sister Blessing showed me the architectural plans last week. She said you were just waiting for the final permit and then construction will begin immediately." Another lie. Another fabrication. Pastor Chidi felt the web of deception tightening around his family, his ministry, his entire life. "I see," he said quietly. "Well, let me discuss this with my wife and get back to you." After Mr. Okoro left, Pastor Chidi sat alone in his office, the weight of his suspicions crushing down on him. He needed proof, concrete evidence of what was happening to their church's money. But more than that, he needed to understand how the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with his life and ministry, could betray him so completely. Outside his church window, he could see Chukwuma in his usual spot, sitting peacefully in the shade of the church's old mango tree. The blind man had been the first to raise questions, the first to notice inconsistencies that others missed. Maybe he was the key to uncovering the truth. Pastor Chidi made his way outside, his heart heavy with the burden of what he suspected. "Brother Chukwuma," he said, settling down on the bench beside the blind man, "I need your help." Chukwuma turned his head toward the pastor's voice, his sightless eyes somehow conveying deep understanding. "You found something, haven't you, Pastor?" "I'm afraid so." Pastor Chidi's voice was barely above a whisper. "But I need more than suspicion. I need proof." "What kind of proof?" Pastor Chidi hesitated. What he was about to ask felt like a betrayal of his marriage, but he knew he had no choice. "I need someone to watch the church office when I am not here. Someone who can observe without being noticed." Chukwuma was quiet for a long moment. "You want me to spy on your wife?" "I want you to help me protect God's house," Pastor Chidi corrected. "If I am wrong, then no harm is done. But if I am right, if you are right, then the house of God is being robbed by someone who should be protecting it." They sat in silence, both men grappling with the gravity of what they were discussing. Finally, Chukwuma nodded. I will help you, Pastor, but you must prepare yourself for what we might find. Over the next week, Chukwuma became the church's unlikely sentinel. His blindness, which had once made him seem helpless, now became his greatest asset. People ignored him, spoke freely around him, and never suspected that he was gathering information. He positioned himself strategically around the church compound, using his acute hearing to monitor conversations and activities. What he discovered was a pattern of deception that went deeper than anyone had imagined. On Tuesday, he overheard Blessing on the phone with someone she called Architect Johnson, discussing changes to their house plans. The conversation revealed that she was building not just a simple duplex, but a mansion with a swimming pool, guest house, and elaborate gardens. The budget had ballooned to over 10 million naira. On Wednesday, he heard her arguing with a jewelry store owner about a delayed payment for a diamond necklace. The price mentioned, 1.5 million naira, was more than the church's annual budget for pastoral care. On Thursday, he listened as she instructed someone to create more fake invoices, this time for a fictional church bus purchase that would justify a 3.5 million naira withdrawal. But the most damning evidence came on Friday, when Blessing thought she was alone in the church office. Chukwuma had positioned himself outside the window, hidden behind the building's old generator. He heard her making phone calls, her voice confident and calculating. Yes, I need another company letterhead, she said to someone. Make it look like a construction company this time. I will need invoices for electrical work, plumbing and painting. Total amount should be 2.8 million naira. She paused, listening to the person on the other end. Of course, my husband will sign it. He trusts me completely. The fool doesn't even read what he is signing anymore. Chukwuma's blood ran cold. Not only was she stealing from the church, but she was also mocking her husband's trust, calling him a fool for believing in her integrity. But there was more. Once this construction project is complete, I will have my own source of income. I am planning to rent out the house to expatriates. The location is perfect. I could charge 500 naira per month easily. Then, I won't need to keep dipping into the church account. The pieces fell into place for Chukwuma. This wasn't just theft. It was a long-term plan to create wealth using stolen money. Blessing was building a real estate empire funded by the sacrificial offerings of poor church members. And if anyone gets suspicious, she said, laughing, I will just blame it on accounting errors. Who is going to question the pastor's wife, especially when I am the one keeping all the records? That afternoon, Chukwuma made his way to Pastor Chidi's office, his walking stick tapping urgently against the concrete. He found the pastor sitting at his desk, staring at a stack of suspicious receipts. Pastor, Chukwuma said, settling into the chair across from the desk. I've heard enough. It's time to act. Pastor Chidi looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and constant worry. Tell me. Chukwuma recounted everything he had heard over the past week. With each revelation, Pastor Chidi's face grew more pale, more stricken. By the time Chukwuma finished, tears were streaming down the pastor's face. 10 million naira, he whispered. She has stolen 10 million naira from God's house. Maybe more, Chukwuma said gently, "Pastor, you need to call the bank. You need to freeze the account before she can take any more." Pastor Chidi nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for his phone. But before he could dial, they heard the sound of high heels creaking on the church's concrete floor. Blessing was coming. "She can't know we suspect anything," Pastor Chidi said quickly. "Not yet. We need to gather all the evidence first." Chukwuma nodded and quietly made his way to the door. "I'll be outside, listening. If you need me, just call." As Blessing entered the office, she found her husband sitting calmly at his desk, papers neatly arranged in front of him. She had no idea that her carefully constructed world was about to collapse around her. "Good afternoon, my dear," she said, kissing his cheek. "How has your day been?" "Enlightening," Pastor Chidi replied, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his heart. "Very enlightening indeed." Saturday morning came with deceptive calm. The church was preparing for Sunday service, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Pastor Chidi had spent the night in prayer and preparation, calling the bank to verify transactions, contacting a lawyer for advice, and most importantly, searching his own heart for the strength to do what needed to be done. Blessing woke up in high spirits. She had successfully orchestrated another fake invoice, this time for a non-existent church van worth 3.5 million naira. The money was already in her personal account, ready to be transferred to her contractor for the house's finishing touches. She was so close to completing her dream home that she could taste it. "Good morning, my love," she said, sliding into bed beside her husband. "You are up early." "Couldn't sleep," Pastor Chidi replied, not looking at her. "I was thinking about tomorrow's sermon." "What's the topic?" she asked, genuinely curious. Pastor Chidi turned to face her, his eyes holding depths she couldn't read. "Betrayal. How it destroys trust, breaks communities, and grieves the heart of God." Something in his tone made Blessing's stomach flutter with unease, but she pushed the feeling aside. "That is a heavy topic. Are you sure it is appropriate for Sunday morning?" "I think it is exactly what our congregation needs to hear," he said quietly. "Sometimes the truth is heavy, but it is still necessary." After breakfast, Blessing announced she was going shopping for a new dress for Sunday service. She had seen a beautiful imported outfit at an expensive boutique, 250,000 naira, but worth it for the impression it will make. After all, she reasoned, a pastor's wife should look prosperous. It would encourage the congregation to give more. Pastor Chidi watched her drive away in a Honda Accord, his heart breaking with each passing moment. This woman, who had once shared his dreams of serving God and helping the poor, had become someone he didn't recognize. The Blessing he married would have been horrified by the thought of stealing from the church. This woman seemed to feel no remorse at all. As soon as she was gone, he called Chukwuma. "Brother, it is time. Can you come to the church office?" Within an hour, Chukwuma arrived, accompanied by Mr. Godwin Okoro and two other church elders, Brother Ikenna and Sister Daisy. Pastor Chidi had decided he needed witnesses, people whose integrity was beyond question. "Pastor, what is this about?" Mr. Okoro asked, settling into one of the office chairs. Pastor Chidi took a deep breath. "I need to show you something. But first, I want you to know that what I am about to reveal will be shocking. It involves my wife and it involves the theft of church funds. The room fell silent. Sister Adaeze gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Brother Ikena leaned forward, his expression grave. Are you certain about this, Pastor? He asked. Unfortunately, yes. Pastor Chidi opened his laptop and pulled up the bank statements. Over the past 8 months, someone has been creating fake invoices and withdrawing money from our church accounts. The total stolen is approximately 4.2 million naira. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Mr. Okoro whistled low. That is a fortune. It gets worse. Pastor Chidi continued. He showed them the forged receipts, the fake company letterheads, the pattern of systematic theft. The person doing this had to have access to our bank accounts, knowledge of our financial procedures, and the ability to forge my signature. But who would do such a thing? Sister Adaeze asked, tears in her eyes. Pastor Chidi exchanged glances with Chukwuma. That's where Brother Chukwuma comes in. He has been observing and listening. Brother, would you tell them what you have discovered? Chukwuma spoke quietly but clearly, recounting the conversations he had overheard, the inconsistencies in Blessing's stories, the evidence of a new car, new house, and expensive lifestyle that couldn't be explained by their legitimate income. As he spoke, the faces of the church elders grew more stricken. These were people who had known Blessing for years, who had trusted her with their money, who had looked up to her as a spiritual leader. Pastor, Mr. Okoro said finally, what do you want to do? I want to confront her, Pastor Chidi replied, but I want to do it properly, with witnesses, with evidence, and with the hope that she will confess and seek forgiveness. And if she doesn't confess, Brother Ikena asked. Pastor Chidi's voice was heavy with sorrow. Then we'll have to involve the authorities. I won't protect anyone, not even my wife, when it comes to stealing from God's house. Sunday morning arrived with unusual tension in the air. The church was packed as always, but the atmosphere felt different. The elders and Pastor Chidi had agreed to wait until after the service to confront Blessing. But everyone who knew what was coming felt the weight of anticipation. Blessing arrived fashionably late, wearing a new imported dress and matching accessories. She looked radiant, confident, completely unaware that her world was about to crumble. She took her usual seat in the front row, Bible in hand, ready to play the role of the devoted pastor's wife. Pastor Chidi stepped up to the pulpit, his sermon notes in hand. He had changed his planned message the night before, feeling led by the Spirit to speak about something more immediate, more personal. Beloved congregation, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the church's old sound system. Today, I want to talk to you about trust. Blessing smiled and nodded, assuming this would be a standard sermon about trusting God. Trust, Pastor Chidi continued, is the foundation of all relationships. In marriage, in friendship, in community, and especially in the church. When we trust someone, we make ourselves vulnerable. We give them power over our life. We give them power over our hearts, our resources, our very lives. The congregation murmured their agreement, some nodding knowingly. They had all experienced the blessing of trust and the pain of betrayal in their own lives. But what happens? Pastor Chidi's voice grew heavier when the trust is broken. What happens when the very people we rely on to protect us become the ones who harm us? Blessing shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Something about her husband's tone was making her nervous. The Bible tells us that it will be better for someone to have a millstone tied around their neck and be thrown into the sea than to cause one of God's little ones to stumble. Today, I stand before you with a heavy heart because someone in this very church has caused many of God's children to stumble. The church grew deadly quiet. You could hear a pin drop. Pastor Chidi looked directly at his wife. The money you have been giving sacrificially, the offerings you have made in faith, believing they would help orphans and widows and the poor, some of that money has been stolen. Gasps echoed throughout the sanctuary. Blessing's face went pale, but she maintained her composure, even managing to look shocked along with everyone else. I know this is difficult to hear, Pastor Chidi continued, but as your pastor, I have a responsibility to tell you the truth. Over the past 8 months, approximately 4.2 million naira has been taken from our church account through fraudulent means. The congregation erupted in whispers and murmurs. Some people stood up. Others started crying. The amount was staggering, more money than most of them would see in a lifetime. Pastor, who did this? Called out Brother James from the back of the church. Pastor Chidi closed his eyes, drawing strength from God for what he had to do next. The person responsible for this theft is someone we all trusted, someone who had access to our bank account, someone who knew our procedures, someone who could forge my signature. Blessing's heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She knew she had to say something, had to deflect suspicion somehow. Pastor, she said, standing up and turning to face the congregation, this is terrible news. We need to call the police immediately. Whoever did this must be brought to justice. The performance was perfect. The right amount of shock, indignation, and righteous anger. But Pastor Chidi wasn't finished. You are right, my dear wife. The person responsible must face justice. He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. That's why I've already called the authorities. At that moment, the church doors opened and in walked 2 police officers, followed by the church elders and Chukuma. The blind man's walking stick tapped against the floor as he made his way to the front of the church. Blessing's legs nearly gave out beneath her. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She was supposed to be safe, protected by her position, by her husband's love, by the trust of the congregation. Before we proceed, Pastor Chidi said, his voice heavy with sorrow, I want to give the guilty party one last chance to confess, to show remorse, to seek forgiveness from God and from this congregation. The church was so quiet that the sound of people breathing seemed loud. All eyes were on Pastor Chidi, waiting to see who would be accused. Blessing knew she had 2 choices: confess and face the consequences, or maintain her innocence and hope she could somehow escape. Pride and fear made the decision for her. Pastor, she said, her voice shaking but defiant, I hope you are not suggesting that I had anything to do with this. I have been faithful to this church, faithful to you, faithful to God. How dare you imply otherwise? Pastor Chidi's heart broke a little more. Even now, with evidence overwhelming, she was choosing to lie. Brother Chukwuma, he said quietly, would you please tell the congregation what you told me? Chukwuma stood up slowly, his unseen high somehow conveying more authority than many sighted people possessed. For weeks, I have been listening and observing. God gave me ears to hear what others missed, and what I heard was the sound of deception. He recounted the conversations he had overheard, the inconsistencies in blessing stories, the evidence of our unexplained wealth. With each revelation, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place for the congregation. But most damning of all, Chukwuma continued, was what I heard last Friday when Sister Blessing thought she was alone in the church office. He repeated word for word the phone conversation he had overheard. Blessing ordering fake invoices, calling her husband a fool for trusting her, bragging about her plan to build a real estate empire with stolen church money. The congregation gasped and murmured with shock and anger. Some people were crying. Others were standing up in outrage. That is a lie, Blessing shouted, her composure finally cracking. He is blind. He couldn't have seen anything. And you can't trust what a beggar says. The words hung in the air like poison. She had just insulted and rejected the man who had tried to help her husband protect the church. You are right, Chukwuma said quietly. I am blind. I am poor. I sit outside your church asking for kindness, but I am not a liar. Pastor Chidi pulled out his laptop. The bank records don't lie either. He displayed the account statements on the church projector. Here are the withdrawals. Fake invoices for equipment we never bought, services we never received, supplies we never ordered. He showed the congregation receipt after receipt, the phantom sound system, the non-existent benches, the imaginary church van. Each document looked official and legitimate, but when church members called the companies listed, they found disconnected phone numbers and fake addresses. And here, Pastor Chidi said, pulling up photos on his phone, is the house my wife is building with your stolen money. The images showed a massive construction project, a luxurious duplex with elaborate designs, expensive materials, and premium finishes. The congregation gasped at the opulence, knowing that such a house would cost millions of naira. How does the wife of a pastor afford a mansion like this? Pastor Chidi asked, his voice breaking. How does she buy a new car worth over 2 million naira? How does she afford designer clothes and jewelry that cost more than most of you earn in a year? Blessing stood in the middle of the sanctuary, surrounded by accusing eyes and overwhelming evidence. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her, and she had nowhere to run. It was a gift, she screamed desperately. From my family. You all know how poor you are. You couldn't understand what it's like to receive blessings from successful relatives. The words were cruel and classist, insulting the very people who had given sacrificially to the church. Many congregation members worked multiple jobs just to survive, yet they still brought their tithes and offerings faithfully. Mrs. Adaize, the elderly woman who shared her bread with Chukwuma, stood up slowly. Her voice was quiet but carried throughout the silent church. Sister Blessing, last year when my husband was dying in the hospital, I came to you asking for help. You told me the church had no money for medical expenses. You said we all had to make sacrifices. My husband died because we couldn't afford the treatment. Tears streamed down her face as she continued. But you were stealing millions while telling us there was no money to save lives. You were building mansions while we buried our loved ones. Other voices joined us. Brother Samuel spoke about his son who couldn't go to university because they couldn't afford the fees, while the church supposedly had no scholarship fund. Sister Grace talked about her family living in a one-room apartment while believing their offerings were going to help other poor families. The human cost of blessings theft was becoming clear. It wasn't just numbers on a bank statement. It was lives affected, dreams crushed, hope destroyed. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the pain she had caused, Blessing made one last attempt to save herself. "Fine," she screamed, her voice echoing through the church. "Yes, I took the money, but I deserved it. Do you know what it's like being married to a pastor? Do you know what it's like living in poverty while watching other pastors' wives drive luxury cars and live in beautiful houses?" The congregation sat in stunned silence as she continued her rant. "I've sacrificed 20 years of my life for this church. 20 years of living like a pauper while my husband gives away every naira to people who don't deserve it. I was tired of being poor, tired of wearing cheap clothes and driving old cars while the church accounts grew fat with money." Pastor Chidi stared at his wife in horror. This wasn't the woman he had married. The woman who had once shared his vision of serving God and helping others. Greed had transformed her into someone he didn't recognize. "So, yes, I took the money," she continued, her voice hysterical, "and I would do it again. You people give your money anyway. At least I used it for something worthwhile instead of wasting it on ungrateful beggars and lazy orphans." The cruelty of her words shocked everyone into silence. She had just admitted to stealing from God's house and shown no remorse for the pain she had caused. But it was her next words that sealed her fate completely. "And you," she pointed at Chukwuma, her voice filled with venom. "You blind fool, you think you are wise, sitting outside my church like some kind of prophet. You are nothing but a useless beggar who should be grateful for the scraps we throw you." The congregation gasped at her cruelty. Chukwuma sat quietly, his face showing neither anger nor hurt, just deep sadness for a soul lost to greed and pride. "You want to know the truth?" Blessing continued, past caring about consequences. "I've been laughing at all of you. Poor, stupid people giving your money to a church that doesn't care about you. At least, when I took it, it went to someone intelligent enough to make something of herself." That was the final straw. The congregation erupted in angry voices, some people standing up and shouting, others crying at the betrayal. These were people who had trusted her, looked up to her, considered her a spiritual mother. Pastor Chidi stood at the pulpit, tears streaming down his face. "Blessing, please stop. You are only making it worse." But she was beyond reason now, consumed by rage and self-justification. Worse? How could it be worse? You want to know what is worse? Being married to a man so naive that he signs papers without reading them, so trusting that he never questioned where money was going. You made it easy for me. The police officer stepped forward, handcuffs ready. They had heard enough. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. One officer said professionally, "You have the right to remain silent." But Blessing wasn't finished. As they put the handcuffs on her, she looked directly at Chukwuma. "This is all your fault," she screamed. "If you had minded your own business, if you had stayed quiet like a good beggar should, none of this would have happened." Chukwuma stood up slowly, his walking stick in his hand, his presence somehow commanding despite his humble appearance. "Sister Blessing," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the church, "I tried to warn you. I gave you chances to confess, to repent, to make things right, but you chose pride over humility, greed over gratitude, lies over truth." He paused, his sightless eyes somehow seeming to look directly at her. "You call me a beggar, and you are right. I am poor. I have no house, no car, no expensive clothes, but I have something you lost: integrity. I would rather sit outside God's house as an honest beggar than stand inside it as a lying thief." The congregation murmured their agreement. In that moment, the blind man who sat outside asking for charity showed more dignity and wisdom than the woman who had stood at the altar preaching about righteousness. As the police led Blessing away, she made one final desperate plea to her husband. "Chidi, you can't let them do this to me. I am your wife. We can work this out. I will pay back the money." Pastor Chidi looked at the woman he had loved for 20 years, the woman who had shared his dreams and his bed, the woman who had now destroyed everything they had built together. "The money isn't the real issue, Blessing," he said sadly. "It's the trust. It's the betrayal. It's the fact that you stole from poor people who believed in you. I can forgive you as a Christian, but I can't protect you from the consequences of your choices." As the police car pulled away with Blessing inside, the congregation sat in stunned silence. Many were crying, not just from anger, but from genuine heartbreak. They had loved her, trusted her, considered her family. Pastor Chidi stood at the pulpit, looking out at his shattered congregation. He knew some of them would leave the church, their faith damaged by this betrayal. Others would stay, but struggle to trust again. The healing process would be long and difficult. "My brothers and sisters," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, "I know you are hurt. I know you are hungry. I know some of you are questioning whether you can trust anyone again." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I failed you. As your pastor, as your leader, I should have been more careful with your offerings. I should have noticed what was happening sooner. I should have protected you better. Pastor, it is not your fault," called out Brother Ikenna. "You trusted your wife. That is what husbands are supposed to do." "But as a pastor, I had a higher responsibility," Chidi replied. "From now on, we will implement new procedures. Multiple people will oversee our finances. Regular audits will be conducted. Your trust will be earned back through transparency and accountability." Old Mrs. Adaize stood up slowly, her voice carrying the wisdom of her years. "Pastor, we all make mistakes. We all trust the wrong people sometimes. What matters is how we move forward. This church is bigger than one person's sin. God's work will continue." Her words seemed to lift the spirits of the congregation. People began nodding, murmuring agreement, finding hope in the midst of their pain. Then Chukwuma stood up. "Pastor, if I may speak." Pastor Chidi nodded. Brother Chukwuma, you have earned the right to address this congregation. Chukwuma made his way to the front of the church, his walking stick tapping against the floor. When he reached the pulpit, he turned to face the congregation he couldn't see but knew so well. My brothers and sisters, he began, today, you have seen the power of pride and greed to destroy lives, but you have also seen the power of truth to set us free. Yes, we have been hurt. Yes, we have been betrayed, but we are still here. We are still God's people. We are still a family. He paused, his voice growing stronger. Sister Blessing called me a beggar, and she was right. I am a beggar, but I have learned something in my years of sitting outside this church, depending on your kindness. True wealth isn't measured in money or houses or cars. True wealth is measured in integrity, in love, in faithfulness to God and to each other. The congregation was completely silent, hanging on every word. This church has made me rich, Chukwuma continued. Rich in friendship, rich in love, rich in purpose. You have shown me that family isn't about blood. It's about choice. You chose to love me, to care for me, to include me. That is worth more than all the mansions in the world. Tears were flowing freely throughout the congregation now. Tears of healing, tears of hope, tears of renewed faith. And to those of you who are questioning whether you can trust again, let me tell you this. Yes, you can. Not because people are perfect, but because God is faithful. Not because leaders never fail, but because God's love never fails. As Chukwuma returned to his seat, something beautiful happened. One by one, members of the congregation began to stand up. They were not leaving. They were showing their commitment to stay, to rebuild, to trust again. Mr. Godwin Okoro stood up first. Pastor, I still want to donate that 5 million naira for the orphanage. But this time, I want Brother Chukwuma to be part of the Financial Oversight Committee. I second that motion, called out Brother Ikenna. Brother Chukwuma has proven he can see things the rest of us miss. Soon, the entire congregation was on their feet, not in anger or protest, but in unity and determination. They had been wounded, but they would heal. They had been betrayed, but they would trust again. They had been robbed, but they would give again. Pastor Chidi looked out at his congregation through tears of gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for staying. Thank you for forgiving. Thank you for choosing love over bitterness. 6 months later, Blessing sat in her prison cell, wearing the standard issue orange uniform that replaced her designer clothes. The trial had been swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence and her own recorded confession. She was sentenced to 8 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. The mansion remained unfinished, seized by the government to recover the stolen funds. The underaccord was sold, along with all her jewelry and expensive possessions. Every naira was returned to the church, plus penalties and interest. But the real punishment wasn't the prison walls or the loss of possessions. It was the isolation. No visitors came to see her. Her husband had filed for divorce, unable to continue a marriage built on lies. Her family had disowned her, ashamed of the scandal she had brought upon them. She had gained wealth but lost everything that truly mattered. Meanwhile, at St. Matthew's Church, healing had begun. The new Financial Oversight Committee, led by Mr. Godwin and Brother Chukwuma, had implemented transparent procedures that rebuilt trust. The orphanage project was back on track, funded not just by the recovered money but by an outpouring of additional donations from people inspired by the church's integrity in handling the crisis. Chukwuma still sat in his usual spot outside the church, but now he was more than just a fixture. He was a respected member of the church leadership. His wisdom, born from years of listening and observing, was sought by members facing difficult decisions. Pastor Chidi had remarried, not to another woman but to his calling. He threw himself into ministry with renewed passion, determined to serve his congregation with complete transparency and humility. The painful experience had made him a better pastor, more compassionate, more careful, more understanding of human weakness. And every Sunday, as he stood at the pulpit, looking out at his congregation, he remembered the lesson learned from a blind beggar who saw more clearly than anyone else. True sight isn't about what you can see with your eyes. It is about what you can perceive with your heart. The truth always finds a way to shine, no matter how deep the darkness that tries to hide it. And sometimes, God uses the most unlikely people, the poor, the marginalized, the overlooked, to expose the sins of the mighty and restore justice to his house. As Chukwuma often said in his new role as a church's wisdom counselor, when you lose your sight, you learn to see with your heart, and the heart never lies. Thank you for watching Raw Tales Africa. If this tale of justice and redemption touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Remember, integrity is worth more than all the wealth in the world, and the truth will always set us free. What did you think of this story? Have you encountered someone who seemed to see more clearly despite their challenges? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep living with integrity, and remember, God sees everything, even when we think we are hidden in the darkness.